I want to talk today about some of the mindset shifts that helped me personally go from a 152 to a 175. It took me an entire year to get there, and a lot of it was a complete waste of time. If I'd done it properly, I probably could have knocked it out in just a few months because the LSAT is a test of pattern recognition. If you can spot the tricks and traps, you can avoid them, and that's when your scores really start to go up. Now, I find a lot of students quitting far too early in their LSAT prep because it makes you feel dumb to get stuff wrong. I totally get it. Too many of us conflate our LSAT scores with our self worth, our future career success. Am I going to make it as a lawyer? Do I have what it takes? And a cold diagnostic is oftentimes discouraging because it tells you what you already know. You have not yet learned the language of the LSAT, but you can. It just takes the right support, the right structure, the right foundation. And unfortunately, it takes more time than a lot of folks expect. If you're just trying to carve out 30 minutes, an hour a day over the course of a couple of weeks, that may not be enough time to make steady, consistent forward progress. You may need to put in more time blocking off in your calendar, maybe 2 to 3 hours a day for 5, 6 days a week over the course of 3 to 4 months. I'm not saying it takes you an entire year. Some folks do spend that long, but you can probably knock it out in less time if you study more efficiently, if you study more effectively. But you also want to set up the support structure around yourself to maximize the likelihood that you actually will put in the time. It typically takes a lot of reps to build a habit, and you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. A lot of folks will say, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And so if you surround yourself with others who are also studying for the LSAT, uplifting you, positive feedback, accountability, it makes it that much more likely that you actually will put in the time, even when the going gets tough. I also want to encourage you to think about lead indicators versus lag indicators. A lead indicator is what you put in, a lag indicator is what you get out. So a lead indicator might be, I spent 100 minutes studying today, or I did 100 LSAT practice questions. A lag indicator would be, my score went up XYZ points, or my score did not go up XYZ points. If you maximize your inputs, you will then maximize the outputs, but it takes time to get there. It might not happen overnight. It might not happen in a week or even a month. But if you put in the time excuse me, I hit my microphone there. If you put in the time consistently over the span of 2 months, 3 months, maybe even 4 months, I guarantee you something is going to change. But it may be that you're not giving yourself enough time on a short time frame to see the results. So you've got to maintain consistency even when you feel like it's not working, even when you feel like you're not seeing steady forward progress. LSAT prep improvement is not linear. It can come in fits and spurts. Sometimes you see a plateau for a while, then suddenly you get a key insight or a breakthrough that changes everything for you. So I want to encourage you that if you're on this LSAT prep journey, if you're a pre-law looking to apply to law school this cycle, maybe next cycle, maybe beyond, I want to encourage you to make a commitment to yourself and your law school goals that you're going to give it at least a couple of months. You're not going to expect overnight success. It takes time. It compounds. If you're feeling burnt out, totally fine. Take a break for a couple days, even a couple weeks maybe, depending on your time frame, and then you can always come back to it. The LSAT's not going anywhere, and it's a test of pattern recognition. It's a test of skills. Doesn't happen overnight. Takes some time to see the results. So I'm going to encourage you, accept now that it may take more time than you expected. The LSAT may have been more than you initially bargained for. But if you put in the time consistently, you will eventually see a breakthrough, and you've got to trust and have faith in that process. Now, I often think about what is the difference between a 150 score and a 170 score, or in my case, a 152 and a 175. What changed for me? I started at 152, improved 23 points, took me an entire year, and at least half of that was a total waste of time. If I'd done it properly, I probably could have knocked it out in just a few months. So what was the change? I think it was coming to see the LSAT from the test maker's perspective. What goes into designing all those tricks and traps? The test makers have a limited set of tricks and traps that bag of tricks doesn't really change. They're actually quite lazy if you think about it that way. What I mean is that they're using the same tools, the same tactics, the same traps over and over and over. And if you do enough practice tests, you will start to see those same recurring methods of reasoning, the same tempting wrong answer choices that are too extreme, for example, or out of scope. And the difference between me and a pre-law just getting started now is that I've had a lot more exposure to those tricks and traps. And so when I see a new question, I can easily and automatically relate it back to what I've seen before. I'm not thinking through the logic of that question for the first time. And so the more you can expose yourself to the tricks and traps of the test, the faster you're going to be able to go in the future, because you're not going to be reasoning through it on the spot on test day under timed conditions when it really counts. And a lot of folks will think to themselves that the LSAT is a test of their intelligence or the test of their natural abilities. And nothing could be further from the truth. The idea of natural born geniuses when it comes to the LSAT, I think, is highly over-indexed and overrated. Your effort and exposure will compound over time. There are 58 numbered exams on LSAC's Law Hub platform. The more of those you do, the more of those you think through and reason through, the more your score is going to improve. It's as simple as that. And if you understood only 10 exams inside and out, that would be enough to get you a 10, 20, even 30-point score increase or beyond. The problem is that a lot of students just take exam after exam, they measure themselves, they're happy or sad about those results, and then they move on to the next thing. But they don't fully understand the questions they got wrong or had difficulty with. And so when they take that next exam, they make that same mistake again. Huge mistake. Unfortunately, that's a lot of wasted effort. If you get a practice test result where you did not get a perfect 180, there is probably something to be learned from that exam. Every question that you get wrong or have difficulty with is an opportunity to learn something new. Most students, though, waste that effort. They waste that time because they don't make the effort on those practice tests. And so I want to encourage you, no matter what you got, whether it was a 179 or a 129 or a 120 for all I care, every question that you got wrong or had difficulty with that perhaps you could have solved more efficiently, or you were down to 2 and guessed and got lucky, but it could have just as easily gone the other way. I want you to review those mistakes in depth. The idea being that if you get the question wrong now, you're not going to get it wrong on test day, because you will have learned the lesson from that question. Now, at LSAT Unplugged, we have a framework that we use to guide students through the review process. It's called the Socratic review method. And it's a cornerstone of my LSAT courses and LSAT coaching. And I'm offering free LSAT tutoring lessons to anyone out there watching this, whether it's on YouTube or Instagram or any of the other platforms. Check out the link below, unpluggedprep.com/start. You can book a free call with me. I'll be happy to walk you through it live in a one-on-one context to help you get to the root cause of the issues that you're facing. And the way we do this is we basically look at what was the mistake stemming from. Was it in the stimulus? Was it in the question stem? Or was it in the choices? If it was in the stimulus, was it LSAC's failure to include key indicator words for the conclusion like thus, therefore, so, and hence? If it was LSAC's failure to include key indicator words for evidence like because and since. Or maybe it was LSAC using unfamiliar words or phrases to refer to the question type in the question stem. Or maybe you just haven't had enough exposure to question types to even know what exactly they're asking for. Now, there are roughly 15 different types of logical reasoning questions. You've also got reading comprehension as well, of course, and some students make the mistake of just jumping into exam after exam after exam without having built the foundation first. We use the LASER approach to LSAT prep when designing our LSAT study plans for students. LASER is an acronym standing for Learning, Accuracy, Sections, Exams, and Review. That learning phase is fundamental. That's where you get the lay of the land. You build a strong foundation in the different sections and the different question types. But if you skip that step, you're making the mistake of burning through valuable, limited practice material before having learned the lay of the land or what the different question types are. For example, you've got conclusion questions, strengthen, weaken, flaw, necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, and so on. We start with conclusion questions because they're the backbone of logical reasoning. You got to be able to ID the conclusion in order to do pretty much anything else in logical reasoning. If you can't ID the conclusion, you want to go back to basics, go back to fundamentals, and start there. And if you're taking the LSAT in a couple weeks and you still haven't been able to ID conclusions consistently, I hate to say it, but you might want to consider pushing back your test date to allow yourself to achieve your fullest potential. It's far better to apply a little bit later in the cycle with a higher LSAT score than earlier in the cycle with a relatively lower LSAT score. And just because you're signed up for a particular LSAT test date doesn't actually mean you have to take it on that date. You can withdraw, and law schools will never even know that you were registered for that LSAT in the first place. And just taking more practice tests, just burning through more of those is not a magic formula to get your score higher. You've got to understand the root cause of your mistakes. And so we look at, was your mistake in the stimulus, or meaning the argument, or the question stem, or the answer choices? Was it a tempting wrong answer? Was it an unappealing right answer? If it was tempting, what made the wrong answer tempting for you? Are you prone to being attracted to extreme or strong language because it feels good and the moderate language feels boring? If you are not drawn to unappealing right answers because the language is too moderate, maybe you want to course correct and look into that as well. But just taking more practice tests is honestly a waste of time. Just as drilling questions without reviewing is also a waste of time. You've got to look at your process. You've got to look at your approach. And this is maybe unsexy, which is why nobody does it, because you prefer the instant feedback of drilling individual questions, or you like the feedback of seeing where your practice test scores are when you take full exams. But if you're not reviewing properly, you're not learning from your mistakes, and that's why your score stays stuck. That's why you plateau. It's why you're lower than you want to be. And so until you master the review process using a framework like the Socratic review method, you may not see the results that you're looking for. And I go over this in depth on YouTube in my coaching playlist where I work with students live. We also do it, of course, inside the coaching program at LSAT Unplugged. Links below in the description. You can also book the free LSAT tutoring lesson, unpluggedprep.com/start. Happy to help you out and walk you through it live. But review is essential. It is fundamental. Now, if you're in the final month before test day, of course, we don't want you to burn out. I don't want you to feel like you have to study 6, 8, 10 hours a day in order to see progress. It could be that actually you need to spend less time in your prep, but you want to use that time more effectively. That could mean doing fewer practice tests and reviewing them in more depth. It could be allowing more time for self-care, like sleep, diet, exercise, relaxation. All of that comes together to help you perform at 110%. If you're sleep deprived, if you're tired, if you're not eating well, if you haven't been outdoors in days, all of that, of course, will have a negative impact on your score. And so we typically recommend capping your prep at just maybe 5, 6 hours a day max if you have no other obligations. If you're working part-time or you're in school, maybe you want to cap it at just 2, 3 hours a day. I don't want you studying at 1 a.m. when you're going to be waking up at 7 a.m. I want you to get 8 hours of sleep because the LSAT requires your brain to be functioning at 110% to achieve your fullest potential. It's as simple as that. We also want you taking days off. We build days off into our students' study plans to help them avoid burnout because it's real. And when your score is suddenly dropping and you have no idea why, burnout is often the culprit. Now, if you are only doing, say, 2, 3 hours a day, you want to make sure that your study time is focused, meaning you're not frantically, randomly checking email every time you hit a hard question or checking social media apps or whatever. You want ideally to put your phone on airplane mode and just do the work, get it done so that you can leave the desk and go do something more fun. 3 hours of dedicated focused study is going to be 10 unfocused hours of mindlessly drilling plus going into other browser tabs on your computer. Just get your 3 hours done, go out and enjoy the rest of the day. Socializing is also nice to do every once in a while, but being holed up in the library for a full day just to do 2 hours of studying is a waste of time. You can do a 2.5-hour practice test, timed, focused, and just get done with it and move on. Now, let's say take those 3 hours, right, and multiply them over the course of a week. You might end up with 18, 20 hours in total, which is plenty. Of course, if you're taking the LSAT in less than a month, maybe you want to do more. But if you're taking it 2, 3, 4, 5 months from now, 20, 25 hours a week is plenty of time when you're studying efficiently and effectively. I mentioned the LASER approach earlier. Again, that's an acronym standing for Learning, Accuracy, Sections, Exams, and Review. And when we create personalized study plans for our students, what we do is we just walk them through each one of those steps. Super simple. But we break it down to individual days. And so if you had, say, 150 days between now and the February LSAT, we would map out day 1, day 2, day 3. The first 30 to 60 days would probably be focused on the L for learning phase, building a strong foundation in the different sections and the different question types. The next phase, A for accuracy, would be drilling questions by type, doing a couple dozen strengthening questions in a row, for example, a couple dozen flaw questions in the row, to allow you to better understand the proper perspective from which to view each section and each question type. We then move you on to S for sections, where you're doing individual timed 35-minute sections to work on your pacing and your time management so that you're not running out of time by the time you get to the end of the section. Ideally, you have roughly 3 minutes to spare at the end. So if you have 35 minutes allotted by LSAC, that means you're finishing at the 32-minute mark. You then have approximately 3 minutes to go back and tackle any questions that you flagged or skipped or would have gotten stuck on. You're now coming back to them and with a fresh look, a new perspective, breaking out of that previous tunnel vision. It might help you get it right. And you also have the confidence and security of already knowing that you've completed the section, you've locked up all the other points. Once you move on from S for sections, you go to E for exams and endurance. This is where you're doing full-length timed practice tests under real-world test day conditions, meaning you're blocking off 2.5 hours in your schedule for the day. You're doing 2 sections back-to-back, taking a 10-minute break. Then you're doing 2 more sections back-to-back, and that's the test. You're doing ideally 1 or 2 of those a week in the final month or so. And then, of course, the R, the last phase, is for review, using the Socratic review method, as I mentioned earlier. You want to incorporate that throughout your prep, though, not just saving it for the end. I just put it there because it makes the LASER acronym work. Now, we've got both reading comprehension and logical reasoning on the test. No more logic games, by the way. If your prep materials still reference logic games, throw them out or give them to your worst enemy, because that would be a huge waste of time to study a section that's no longer on the test, right? Logical reasoning is 2 out of the 3 scored sections. Reading comp is the remaining 1 out of 3 scored sections. And so you want to spend roughly 2/3 of your study time on logical reasoning in particular, since it's 2/3 of the test. But don't neglect reading comp either, because it matters, and it's not like your SAT reading comp or ACT reading comp. It's a fundamentally different animal. But because logical reasoning is less familiar and it's easier to improve in logical reasoning and it's 2/3 of the test, we do want you to start there and typically give it more time, all else being equal. Now, you've got 15 different types of logical reasoning questions, like strengthen, weaken, flaw, necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, and so on. But not all of those are of equal importance because some are more frequently showing up than others. The 3 most common types of logical reasoning questions are necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. So ideally, that's where you want to start. You then move on to the less common types and save the rarest ones like parallel and evaluate the argument for last. Now, if your test date is just 1 month away, focus on the highest yield areas only, like necessary assumption, inference, and flaw, and logical reasoning. If you have a year, of course, or 6 months, you will have plenty of time to cover everything in depth, but I'd still focus on the highest yield or highest leverage areas first, meaning the most common question types. And if your test is only a few weeks away, of course, we're hopefully past the fundamentals and focusing more on just full-length practice tests, because ultimately that's what really matters at the end of the day. We got to get the questions right under test day conditions. Now, I got a question here from Wendy talking about taking too long to predict things. Great question, great point. And so predictions in logical reasoning are really important for a lot of different question types. This is also called pre-phrasing, by the way. And so pre-phrasing is when you read the argument or the stimulus, you read the question stem, and you have your own idea in your mind in terms of what you're looking for in the choices. So for a flaw question, for example, the argument they're telling you has a flaw inherent within it, meaning the person who made the argument made a big mistake and they failed to consider something important. That could be that they confused necessary and sufficient conditions, for example. It could be that they just failed to consider something random. It could be that they made an ad hominem personal attack, or they appealed to authority when the expertise was outside the scope of the person's actual authority. So, for example, a doctor who is making claims about whether it's going to rain today, a medical doctor is not qualified to talk about the weather. That'd be a meteorologist's purview, right? So, whatever the flaw is, you want to read the argument and ideally have a sense of what the flaw is, meaning that you already know what is wrong with the argument before you go into the choices. That way, when you go to the choices, you're just looking for LSAC's articulation of the flaw. It's a lot easier to ID their articulation if you already have your own sense of what was wrong with the argument, because that'll make it easier to navigate LSAC's less than ideal wording. So some types lend themselves to pre-phrasing or prediction. Other types don't. For example, there are a lot of different ways to strengthen or weaken an argument. Now, you may have your own idea of what might be the ideal way to strengthen or weaken it. And so if you happen to have a prediction, that's great. Go into the choices with your own idea of what the strengthener or weakener would be, but also be open to alternative ways to strengthen or weaken the argument. And for must be true or most strongly supported, for example, where the answer might be a paraphrase of the stimulus or might be an inference or combination of multiple parts of the stimulus, there are lots of different things that must be true or are likely to be true based on the argument and or stimulus, and your prediction may not match what LSAC chose. So in other words, if you can predict, great. If not, don't worry about it. Just go on to the choices and hope that something jumps out to you and appeals to you as being the correct answer. But yeah, great point there, Wendy. Now, let's talk about how to spot the conclusion in arguments, because that is the fundamental building block of logical reasoning. We look for indicator words, of course, like thus, therefore, so, hence, for this reason, for example. Lots of different ways to identify or indicate a conclusion. But LSAC will not always give us an indicator word. It's nice when they do, but we can't count on it. So we actually have to look at the relationships between different parts of the argument. We have to ask, for example, why? What is their justification for any given claim? We just look for each sentence or each clause, each part of the stimulus, and then we ask why. What is your evidence backing this up? What is the reason for this claim? What is the support for this claim? And when we look at each part and ask that question, there's going to be one particular part in the argument that is supported by something else. The part that is supported is the conclusion, and the support for that conclusion would be our evidence or premise. Now, there are also other parts of arguments. For example, you have a counter premise, which is going against the main point of the argument, but they are acknowledging a weakness or a counterpoint. There could also be filler, which is just there to distract you like a red herring. Doesn't belong there, doesn't do or add anything, or maybe it just sets the stage. You also have sub-conclusions where A supports B, B supports C. So C would be the main conclusion in that case. B is a sub-conclusion or intermediate conclusion because B is supported by A, but in turn, B then supports C. And they can present these in any order, by the way. So the main conclusion could be the first part, it could be the middle part, it could be the last part. They are in no obligation to give you things in the ideal order for you. They are under no obligation to even give you indicator words at all. For easier questions, they will. For harder questions, they won't. And for an intermediate difficulty level question, they'll give you some indicators, but not as many as they could have. So that's conclusion questions. Now let's talk about necessary assumption versus sufficient assumption, since this is one of the biggest sticking points for students. When I first encounter a student, work with them for the first time in a one-on-one context, I usually ask them about this, because if they are not clear on the distinction and we correct that misconception, it usually leads to a pretty quick score boost. And by the way, if you're looking for direct support on your LSAT journey, if you're looking for help, I'm offering free LSAT coaching lessons, free private one-on-one sessions at unpluggedprep.com/start. feel free to book a call with me through that link, unpluggedprep.com/start. If you're watching this on Instagram, just go to the link in my bio. If you're on YouTube, link below this video. And Mas Loka, no, this is not pre-recorded. I see your comment here. Feel free to ask a question before I have to jump off, but I appreciate your asking. This is real. This is live. I'm happy to help out. And so necessary assumption versus sufficient assumption. Necessary assumption is far more common, first of all, so you want to master those first. There are key indicator words in the question stem telling you whether it's necessary assumption or sufficient assumption. Specifically, it is the keyword or phrase synonymous with necessity or sufficiency. And so necessary assumption questions will have words and phrases like depends upon, requires, and assumes, synonymous with necessity. Sufficient assumption questions will have words and phrases synonymous with sufficiency like allows, enables, properly inferred if assumed, and properly logically follows if assumed. All of those are synonymous with sufficiency. And so for necessary assumption questions, they are actually a very specific kind of must be true question because they are required by the argument. In other words, someone who is logically committed to believing in the argument is committed to all underlying necessary assumptions. For example, if someone made the claim that God created the world, they would then be required to believe there is or was a God at some point. You can't believe God created the world if you never believed there was a God in the beginning to begin with, right? So that is inherent or assumed in the claim. For a sufficient assumption question, though, we are viewing the correct answer as new information that, if true, would guarantee the argument 100%, leaving no ambiguity at all. And so, for example, if we had a claim saying, my dog chased your cat, if we learned as new information that any dog will chase any cat given the opportunity, that would then guarantee the specific example. It is broader or more general than the example, like a principle, but if true or if valid, it will guarantee the particular case. So I think about it like this in terms of the distinction. If you wanted to buy a $1 item, it is necessary to possess the value of a penny. A penny is not enough to buy a dollar item, but it is required. In contrast, $1,000 or $1 million is sufficient to buy a $1 item, but is not required because you could have less than $1,000 or $1 million if you had $5 or $10. That would still be enough to buy a $1 item. Doesn't matter how extreme the claim is for sufficient assumption, as long as it gets the job done. And for necessary assumption, doesn't matter how moderate or small in scope the answer is, as long as it was in fact required by the claim in the argument. And so I hope that clears up that distinction. And I hope you folks found this helpful. Again, if you'd like my support, you can get a free LSAT tutoring lesson at unpluggedprep.com/start. Link in my bio on Instagram, link below the video on YouTube. I'm happy to help. Thanks for watching, folks. All the best. See you next time.